One team that we may not be seeing very long is the Memphis Grizzlies. They fired Taylor Jenkins in what was pretty shocking manner. And they hired a gentleman named Tuomas Iisalo. Hopefully Iisalo, I think I pronounced his name the right way.
I think I should applaud because you nailed it. Good job, buddy.
If I did, yeah. I did. If I didn't, I sincerely apologize. Maybe we will get a chance to know you. You and Fred Katz and Joe Varden co-wrote a pretty comprehensive article on The Athletic about like not just the timing of it, but the circumstances surrounding the firing. Very curious in the last 10 games or so. What details struck out to you the most besides the timing of it with 9-10 games left in the season?
I mean, for one, I guess as a quick macro commentary, this is another one of those situations where in terms of the way we cover the league, we all try to do our best, right? But you and I both know that there are small market teams like the one in where I live, you know, to give a comparison, like Sacramento, where the national audience is not paying attention very closely on a regular basis. And so I think the shock value when a guy like Taylor Jenkins gets fired in Memphis, where we are watching, it's not like we're not tracking what the Grizz are doing, but we're not there every day to feel the room and to understand the dynamics. And so shock value, I think because of that, is higher. And then I think to me, and we'll get into it, but this is one of those situations that's got, you know, like most of them do, multiple layers. Like you have the very straightforward basketball stuff, which is that since February 8th, they had been pretty bad and really fallen off a cliff after they were second in the West at that time, had a fantastic record up until that point, going the wrong direction. The good old-fashioned basketball stuff is just, you know, kind of black and white, if that makes sense. Then you have the personal stuff. Taylor's a guy who was a foundational member of this group, you know, Ja Morant's only coach, partnered with Zach Kleiman, you know, the head of the front office, and culturally was as influential on that group as anybody else. So I think that is why when we saw him get uninvited from the party, that's why everybody was so surprised.
Yeah, I think when you look at events from the past week, right? Like we think of each thing, I know, at least I tend to, like we almost like you start at the end and you roll your way back to the beginning and you're like, oh my God, it's so obvious that this thing happened. You talked about the basketball stuff. Yeah. You looked at Desmond Bane getting into a shoving match with a teammate on the sidelines, you know, telling them to play defense. And usually guys will bark at each other, but very rarely does it get physical. Then you look at, man, Ja Morant is not having the same sort of impact on winning and impact on games that he normally has had, even though this is his first season coming back from all the injuries that he had last season. It looks like the offense has been tailored more around Jaren Jackson Jr. and Ja's not necessarily running the pick and roll, getting downhill, everything else. And then you have the fact that Taylor Jenkins did receive a 3-year contract extension in the offseason, but they fired his staff and brought in a new staff. If that doesn't signal, hey, you're on the hot seat, it's a pretty big precursor. But like you said, Sam, we only pay so much attention. We only have so much bandwidth for a franchise like the Memphis Grizzlies because we've kind of seen their movies in a way. We kind of put them in a, I feel like we kind of put them in a, we're going to wait until we see you prove yourself. And they hadn't a chance to prove themselves in the playoff stage yet. But I feel like we have all these fascinating questions about them right now.
100%. Like, I shouldn't admit this publicly, but I'm curious to ask you, like in the summer when they swapped out the coaching staff, to what degree was that on your radar?
Like zero. Like it wasn't, it wasn't even a thought. Like someone mentioned it to me and they, you know, so you know how we talk to people after something happens and like, you don't remember when we talked about this? And I'm like, I talked to a million people about a million things, like that minute detail just slipped past me even in casual conversation.
Right. And so then once you kind of have to reflect back on that and have more clarity and say, yes, like, you know, we kind of wrote the writing is on the wall. I had a line about how, you know, and it was written in tears, not trying to be dramatic, but I was told that Taylor, when he said goodbye to his 5 assistant coaches, was pretty emotional about it. Another sign from a human standpoint that, you know, all is not well. If he is, getting emotional saying goodbye to these particular folks, then it's a pretty clear sign that this is not his preference, is to make these moves. Now, again, getting more clarity here, the thing that jumped out to me big time as we try to report the story out, and obviously, we turned it pretty quick. So it's one of those where you just try, calling as many people as you can, using what you had going in. But now I'm gonna fail at nailing the new coach's name. Vinny, you're the boss here. Give me the pronunciation
Tuomas
one more time.
Iisalo.
Tuomas Iisalo. Yes, I'm gonna have to get that down. So Mr. Iisalo in the summer was not only one of the new additions, but he was a coveted. Again, we are guilty when we cover the NBA of not having a depth enough knowledge of some of the international players. You know what I mean? And I'm talking. This is a guy who was very, very respected for his time at Paris Basket, was coveted by the Grizzlies. They go get him. They have to buy him out to get him. They give him a 7-figure contract, multiple years. That doesn't happen in this league. And that is where I'm curious to see going forward. Like, all right, so you called him interim now. Is that just for show? Is he auditioning for the job, or does he have it already? You know what I mean? Because to me, it does feel, and this is not a great comp. I already mentioned Sacramento a second ago, but like when Doug Christie took over for Mike Brown, there was a little bit of a sense of inevitability because people within the organization wanted Doug to be the coach. It feels that way in Memphis a little bit as well. Now, the distinction that is fair to make, in defense of the Grizzlies is that at least this time it's the GM making this choice, not the owner. And it's a coach who, in Tuomas, who is accomplished in his own right. And, to go a little deeper on it, Vinny, as you know, you got some fascinating philosophical stuff happening here too, where Tuomas was the one who, was heading the charge on changing the offense. You already mentioned it, getting away from pick and rolls. The type of stuff that by all accounts, Ja Morant wasn't really enjoying. His numbers were suppressed a bit. And so, man, it's so hard to follow all these choices and unpack the meaning because, you got rid of Ja Morant's only head coach that he's ever had. We were told that he supported Taylor until the end and was not, and by any means, if anything, he was hoping they wouldn't make this move. But then they also fired another assistant who had taken over for Blake Ahern. So not to get in the weeds, Blake Ahern was let go last summer. Yep. Ja liked Blake a lot, and I heard he was upset about that choice. Then Noah LaRoche, who took his job, is also out in this latest decision. So point being, to drill down on the biggest, most important thing is that Tuomas to me feels like the organization and Zach in particular is more invested in him than we obviously realized before.
Look, there's a number of things, and I want to put a pin in the Ja Morant part because I really want to get back to that because I think that's a part that we have to really discuss. One thing, and I wish I had written about it, but I just didn't have enough comprehensive details, and I didn't want to make it seem so salacious that this would be the one detail of the story. But multiple sources had told me, go look at Memphis's last 3 games. Go tell me who you don't see on the sidelines. And I'm like, help me out here. And they were saying that Iisalo was not on the sidelines the last 3 Memphis games of the past week. I'm not saying that there was something happening between Taylor Jenkins and Iisalo. I'm not pointing to that. I just think that is a very fascinating thing when that leads up to the firing that happens at the time that it happened, and you did not immediately have the interim coach named in the press release. Normally, when a coach is fired and it's in the middle of the season, it's everybody's on the same page, at least publicly, right? It's, hey, we want to thank Coach X for his time. This person is going to step in. We had to wait 2 hours before we found out officially that Iisalo was the guy. And if it happened on a Friday morning with 10 games left in the season, something tells me that the relationship had gotten so tenuous and that maybe, this is me talking, I'm wondering if Taylor Jenkins just forced their hand. He's like, look, if you guys are going to do this to me and put all the writing on the wall, then just fire me now. Like, don't embarrass me in this way. Fire me now. That's what it signals to me. I'm not saying anybody told me that. That's just the inference that I get from all of these small, very micro details. Sam. Like, it just feels odd to me. Not just the timing, but just those 2 hours in between where you don't have your ducks in a row.
No, I mean, that's great detail. I didn't know that about Tuomas not being on the bench. I don't know what to make of it. That's pretty fascinating. I will say, Taylor's camp, if you will, was surprised that this is not, I didn't have anybody telling me, stuff started popping off a couple days before we saw this coming. Like, nope, and there wasn't any communication given beyond Taylor, at least by the time the news broke, to his agent. Mm-hmm. So take that for what it's worth.
Yeah.
And like always, we don't need to be naive. Like, do people always tell us what they actually knew or what they know? Obviously not. For political reasons, a lot of times they don't. But it did strike me that in terms of, to your point, kind of the question of what the hell happened at the end and the element of surprise, like, we couldn't find an agent who was tied to this team who wasn't stunned. They were all stunned. Now, the one, admittedly, I don't mind sharing this, Mike Miller is Ja's agent. I didn't connect with Mike, so I don't know how Mike saw it. Everybody else involved, shocked, couldn't believe it happened. But then, like we already highlighted and recapped, then once they hit the rewind button and start looking at the signs and you see the writing on the wall, there's this, institutional lack of support, I guess, or diminishing support for Taylor, where they clearly were not buying what he was selling nearly to the degree they had before. And the tension, was rising and they make this move. I mean, we got plenty of storylines to cover going into these playoffs, but now the Grizzlies suddenly become like you got to watch them every night because you want to see, are they any different? What's the vibe? You talked about Desmond and Santi getting into it. This is a proud bunch of dudes who not too long ago were like they were the up and coming squad in the West. They were challenging the Warriors. I'll never forget, not to ramble on you, Vinny, but like when they lost to the Warriors in the playoffs a couple years back, second round, I'm sitting in the press conference listening to, forget if it was Steve Kerr. No, I'm sorry. Let me, that didn't make any sense. It was a Grizzlies press conference. I think Ja. The point is that I'm sitting there and somebody asked the Grizzlies person on the podium if the Warriors experience is what, made the difference in the end in that series. Well, Jaren Jackson Jr. had decided to come sit next to me or just in the press area.
I remember that.
Yeah.
I remember
and
that.
Like, the point is, like, man, like, they were on the come up. They were so hungry, and he was so pissed about that loss that he just wanted to go sit in it and hear everybody's thoughts. And when the question came about basically, were you guys too young to take advantage of this, Jaren, like, got visibly annoyed, and he's shaking his head, talking to himself as if he didn't even know he was saying stuff out loud. And he was just like, man, get the hell out of here with that stuff. Like, they were fired up. They were coming. They were going to be the next big thing in the West. And then obviously
they were defiant.
They were very defiant. Yeah.
They were defiant that day. For those who don't remember, the Grizzlies were favored in that series. Like, we go back and look at the 22 Warriors and like, man, they won a championship. They almost won it almost by a surprise of themselves, because going into that series, Ja misses that layup in game 1, I believe. He just shoots it too hard. They come back and win game 2. Game 3 and game 4, there was the whole, Ja's knee and Jordan Poole, I think, where there was this weird thing where the respect for the game thing, it was very much like young lion versus old lion. Except we thought the young lion was going to supersede the old lion in that series. They had home court advantage. Right. They had the young bucks, all of that stuff. We just weren't sure if the Warriors' time had really passed. And after the series, you just had this feeling, oh, this team is going to be around. Like, they're going to smooth out some of these rough edges. Like, Ja Morant hadn't gotten into any trouble at that point. And you thought Taylor Jenkins was a stable head coach that was going to be able to lead. Now, maybe Taylor Jenkins is a guy, Sam, that can help you get to a certain point and you wind up maxing out with him. Like, we see those type of coaches all the time, and then you get someone else to come in. I don't know if that's necessarily the case. The one thing I do find really fascinating about this entire thing is that Zach Kleiman has a tremendous hold on the basketball operations. He's a, analytics guy. He has control of the team's social media. Like, he's very intentional on controlling the message. And yet he talked for a grand total of 2.5 minutes on Saturday morning in the aftermath of it, like basically completely closing ranks. Like, no, you didn't hear from players in the pregame of the Lakers game that they wound up playing that night and they lost. So it just seems like to me that this is a one voice. I made this decision. He went very clear to say the players weren't involved. And the players had better not been involved. Like, you can't let players make that decision after 73 games. And you better wear this decision as a front office person because this just doesn't look good.
Yeah. No, that's all fair. I mean, again, I'm fascinated by the comp to the recent Kings situation because, to spin
the Sacramento Kings are the franchise that fires people the right way, Sam. That's what you're trying to say.
That's
they
right.
mercifully fired Mike Brown. They didn't wait till 73 games to the season. They let him go early.
I mean, they could have let that man walk on the team plane and be awkwardly sitting there for hours, not actually being the head coach anymore. They got him on the road to the airport, damn it. But here's the comp, because I know you wanted to get into the Ja stuff. Is like, man, like that, the story we wrote on the Kings at the time was kind of like, how had a line about how this was a clinic on how to alienate a star player. And Fox, like Ja, liked the coach who was fired. Fox, like Ja, is a guy who around the league, everybody had already been talking about, wondering what his future would hold, wondering if Memphis might be willing to move him. As you know, recently, our buddy and esteemed PBWA president from The Ringer, Howard Beck, had stirred it up a bit because on a podcast he mentioned that an executive told him, look out for Ja maybe being on the move. Zach Kleiman felt compelled, by Howard's perspective to, because it kind of, as happens on social media, it caught fire a little bit. So then Zach fired back and publicly made a statement about, we're not trading Ja, and basically saying teams can keep dreaming. But there, it's one of those like where there's smoke, there's fire things at this point, and the league is going to continue watching the Ja situation. They were going to anyway, though, Vinny. But now, like, you took his coach, you have the offense that is imperfect for his purposes, and then you have an arc, if you will, as a team that is not going in the direction that someone of his age and his talent obviously would prefer.
Look, he is 2 years into that Supermax, the rookie Supermax deal. So the one thing I'd heard around the trade deadline, and I'm curious if you just heard whispers. I heard whispers about Ja Morant around the trade deadline, and we're chasing the Kevin Durant part of it. We're chasing the Jimmy Butler part of it. And someone just says to me, you might want to check around Memphis. Hearing not so great things about Ja's relationship with Memphis and if they are willing to come off of him or what that will look like. And it's one of those things you chase and you wind up checking in with some people and they say, man, no, there's nothing to that. That's insane. And you sort of stick it in your pocket. Right. And then something like this happens and you wonder if there's really some fire to that smoke. So it bears watching, Sam, as we move forward. But I do think that Ja, with his injury history, is somewhat of a risk for a franchise, more of an injury risk than a behavioral risk, as probably we would have expected to say a year and a half ago.
No, I agree. But neither one of those are great, right? Because teams that might think about doing something to get Ja, they're not in the building, so they can't have an updated, accurate sense of where he's at as a person. Has he matured? Is he somebody you can trust, to be the head of your franchise from a PR standpoint? So that's going to be part of the calculus. Then the health, early this year, he talked about how he wasn't going to dunk anymore, which is such a, travesty because he's just so incredible. But you get it. Right. It's like that Russell Westbrook thing. Like, you're going to beat yourself up and cut your career short. So, no, I'm officially now in the camp of, it's worth watching. And a lot of this stuff is, to me, plainly obvious. As much as the Grizzlies always wanted to act like there was no residue from Ja's, off the court chapter, you know what I mean? Like, there's just no way. There's no way. Like, the relationship wise, in terms of him and the organization, that is what we call baggage. No matter what walk of life you're in, they have that baggage. Now they have basketball baggage where they're not able to figure it out and be a contender. I mean, although, my goodness, they're fourth in the West. They're not exactly slouches right now. Right. But, again, worth watching. We'll see where it goes.
Yeah, I will say this as we close this out. If you are concerned that your offense is too Ja-centric, that your team is too Ja-centric, and you're worried about him from like, hey, he might get suspended, or hey, he might get hurt, you might actually change your philosophy so that you are not so Ja dependent, and then that will make Ja not feel so good.